Well, welcome back. Last week I talked about vulnerability. I explained the theory of vulnerability and gave examples of this in the case of the Pacific Islands. This week I want to focus on the idea of adaptation, responding to climate change. And some of the examples I'll use will be from the Pacific, some will be from elsewhere. We'll explain this in theory and then see how it works in practice. So adaptation is about responding to change. And from a research point of view, it's an interesting issue. We have theories about how societies respond to change and how they might respond to climate change. But actually, in some ways, the evidence is quite slim. We don't have too many examples of specific instances where people have decided climate change is coming, let's begin to adapt to that. What we have then is a range of all sorts of other evidence, the way societies have changed over time and what's enabled those forms of change. How come some societies became wealthy and some didn't? How come past civilisations were able to deal with environmental change and some were not? In the Pacific, what is it that's enabled people to settle and live in these islands for thousands of years? What are the lessons from those examples and how do we apply them to the issue of responding to climate change? And other forms of evidence, for example, responding to natural disasters as well, are the kinds of evidence we use. And so when talking about adapting to climate change, we have quite a lot of theory based on evidence from examples that aren't really about adapting to climate change, but are about adapting to all sorts of other kinds of environmental and social changes. So the issue with adaptation is a main policy theme within climate change, typically divided between mitigation, reducing emissions, and adaptation, which is responding to the changes that are likely to arise because we are not doing a very good job in reducing emissions. The existing concentrations of gases in the atmosphere mean that some degree of climate change is now inevitable. And if we are not able to reduce our emissions significantly, a lot of climate change is likely. That means there will be changes in the social and ecological systems that we live in, and we have a choice as to try and whether we want to plan to manage those changes or not. But either way, change is coming, adaptation is going to be required. A fairly easy way of thinking about adaptation is to remember that if vulnerability is about exposure to a risk, sensitivity to the impacts on those risks and the ability to respond to those risks, then adaptation might involve addressing one of these or more of these three elements of vulnerability. Altering the exposure or a system that's at risk. If it's on a low-lying floodplain, if a house is in a low-lying floodplain, moving the house would be altering its exposure and could be said to be adaptation. Reducing the sensitivity of the system exposed to risk. So if the house is on a floodplain and it can't be moved, then elevating that house so that it's on stilts, so floodwaters go underneath without damaging the house, could be said to be an adaptation. Or increasing the capacity to deal with the risk, building the ability of systems to respond to change even if the response is unimplemented. And so we might think in our house and flooding example of insurance as being a form of capacity to respond to risk. So it helps to think about adaptation responses as being about one or more of addressing exposure, sensitivity, or building capacity. And it's useful to keep this in mind as we go forward over the coming lectures. If you were to pick up the body of academic literature and policy literature on climate change adaptation, up until a couple of years ago, you would have been left with an impression overwhelmingly that adaptation was a fairly easy thing to do, that it's just a question of engineering things better, management standards, that it's all very predictable in a linear kind of way, and it's all good. But we're coming to realise as we start to do more research on this and as we start to really think through this and as we begin to get examples of efforts to promote adaptation to climate change, it's actually very complicated. It's about trying to deal with forms of change, and like all forms of social change, planned or unplanned, there's winners and losers, there's problems of coordination and so on. So if you think about a coast, if you think about the coast near where you live, and you go down there and you think sea level rise is coming, and take a look around, you'll see lots of private houses who are going to make their decisions and going to want to make their own sorts of decisions with or without the support of government or planning frameworks. There'll be public land as well, there'll be parks, beaches, jetties, recreation reserves and so on. Who makes decisions about those? There'll be different levels of government who may have a say in this issue. There'll be private businesses who may have their own interest in terms of adaptation. There'll be people who are trying to make money out of this, companies who are going to want to build seawalls and get paid. There'll be environmental groups who are not going to want to see seawalls built because it's going to damage flora and fauna and so on. Actually, adaptation becomes quite complicated. It involves lots of actors working across lots of scales with lots of different motives and interests and capabilities, trying to deal with an uncertain problem that will unfold over decades, if not centuries. That's not easy to do well and in a coordinated way. It's generally considered, if we plan for adaptation, if we try to put things in place now, it will be cheaper and better organised than if we just let it happen and everything's reacting all the time to climate change. And that's certainly true, and there's various forms of evidence, including economic evidence, that shows that planning adaptation as much as possible is a good idea. But if we don't plan and climate begins to change, there will be responses, and some people will adapt, some people will be able to deal with climate change, some people will not deal with it so successfully, you might not say that they've adapted. And the whole problem of coordinating this across public and private levels of action and so on is quite complicated. So adaptation is not easy. Another characteristic of the body of thinking about adaptation, at least until recently, was that it's a good thing, and much like the concept of development, adaptation is good for everybody. It's a universal public good that everybody benefits from equally. But it's also quite clear that that's not true either. As with any form of social change, there will be winners and losers. And this depends on what the purpose of adaptation is. Whose interests and what is it trying to protect? If you go back to the beach example, you can build seawalls. They're very expensive and they cost a lot of money to maintain. And you can do that to protect people's property. And some people who have political power or economic power will get seawalls. Some people won't. For some people, the government will make a decision. It's justified, we're going to defend these cities because there's lots of capital value and it's cheaper to defend them than not. But if the capital value isn't there, if you're a small country town or a house on its own, you're not going to get a seawall. Other people will be opposed to seawalls because they impact on the environment, they destroy beaches, they impact on native vegetation and so on. So it depends on what's important. What's the point of adaptation? Whose interests are they trying to protect? Depends a bit on who wins and who loses. How it happens is also important. Is it going to be done by unilateral decision by some higher authority? You will adapt in this way. Or will it be a consultative process? Will it happen very quickly? We want this problem solved in the next year. Or is it an iterative planning kind of issue that will unfold over many, many years? Who makes decisions on the basis of what information? What else could be done? The opportunity cost of different adaptation decisions. Does it make sense to build a seawall and spend money that way, or does it make sense to elevate properties or invest in an insurance scheme? And so through all these kinds of processes, there are winners and losers in adaptation, and beginning to see actually that adaptation can be a policy instrument that particular vested interests in not particularly fair processes can use to achieve certain ends. There's concern, for example, about land grabbing around adaptation in order to save these so-called vulnerable people. We'll try and move them, and of course once they're off the land, then that land can become somebody else's property, for example. So there's all sorts of questions we can ask about who is adapting, and if you think about this as a complex process, we begin to ask, well, there's individuals who will make decisions that are perhaps in their interests. There are families, there are households. We can think about this in terms of different scales of social organisation. Communities, community organisations and non-governmental organisations, and they're going to make their decisions according to what's important to them. For some families, it'll be staying in this place where we grew up, or on our farm, or on our beach, or on our island for as long as we possibly can. For others, their decision making will be, I want the best life that I can get for my children, and I'm willing to move my family, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get them to a good school. For communities, it may be, we want to maintain our community, we're proud of who we are, we like where we live, it's important to us to live in this place. For others, it could be about trying to maintain social networks, and their relationships to the particular places where they form are not important. There are going to be adaptations for all sorts of service providers. One of the interesting concerns in Australia at the moment is the way responses to water and electricity problems that are arising from climate change are driving up prices. And the cost for community service providers who are providing meals and social services and employment and training services in the community sector are rising because power and energy bills are rising. So they have to adapt their own business models in order to be able to continue to provide community services. There are all sorts of employment implications from climate change, and there are potential jobs in adapting to climate change and providing new technologies, new engineering solutions, new management solutions. But there may also be job losses around certain forms of climate change and certain forms of adaptation as well. And so employers, professional associations, trades associations also are having to contend with climate change and think about what it means for them and how they're going to respond. Governments clearly have a fairly significant responsibility, and it's an interesting question about the limits of government responsibility. If governments exist to provide public goods, then some things that are at risk and that will need to be adapted are clearly public goods, public land, for example. But some things are not so obviously public goods. Is water a public good? Is that government's responsibility to ensure that everybody's still able to access drinking water? Or is that something that should be left to the market? Is social justice a public good that governments should be concerned about? And different governments have different views about this. So the scope of what governments are considering as being their responsibility for adaptation varies quite a bit, depending on the, I guess, the political philosophy of different governments and different government systems. There's questions about responsibility for public and private goods in another way too. And so some people would say in a highly individualistic society, perhaps in the United States, my property is my responsibility and I will make all the decisions I have to make about adaptation, and I don't want governments to be involved. Others, and research in Australia shows that actually people want to be involved in making decisions about their own households and how they're going to deal with climate change, but they do really want guidelines and regulations from the government to help them do that. Lots of complicated issues here. And then there's the question about what's the point of adaptation? What are we trying to protect? What are we trying to sustain in the face of climate change? And sometimes the adaptation solutions might be more of a problem than the impacts of climate change. So this is about issues of scale. A national government will have a different set of priorities for adaptation than a local government. A local government will be trying to make sure that the roads aren't flooded, that the electricity still works and that the rubbish has somewhere to go. National governments will be much more concerned about the overall performance of the economy and national defence, healthcare perhaps. And it's possible that not all the goals that everybody has to adapt to climate change can be satisfied, and that some trade-offs may need to be made. There might need to be a trade-off between protecting those properties on the coast with a seawall or maintaining a beach. And here's an interesting example. In Australia, we have a large river basin called the Murray-Darling Basin. This is it shown in green. Most of the water in this basin is allocated, if not over-allocated, and a lot of it goes into agriculture. But it also supplies cities. Our capital city, Canberra, for example, is in there. And then there's coal seam gas mining coming in, which is also taking water. So there's a lot of competition for water. And the principle, basically speaking, and this is a basin that's significantly affected by drought, went through a 10-year drought recently, that had significant economic impacts. A principal mechanism for allocating water in the basin now is through the use of water markets, permits and trading, and the pricing of water. Now, this involves trade-offs across different levels. Across the basin, and the national government and to some degree the state governments want to see economic productivity from the basin to continue to be at the same level, if not grow. And so they see water as a factor of production, and they're principally concerned to ensure that it's efficiently allocated to where it can produce the most value of activity. So it's an economic goal. And they're very keen to make sure then that those who can most afford to pay for water, which are those who can make the most money out of water as an input, are able to get it, and those for whom maybe can't make much money, smallholder farmers in the middle of the basin who don't produce much value, can't afford to buy water, well, they won't get it because it's not an efficient use of water. So water pricing and trading will tend to see water go to those who can most afford to pay for it, who are those who can make the most value out of it. But it has trade-offs. It may see water go to cities, it may see water go to coal seam gas, it may see water go to higher forms of agricultural production, nuts or fruit, but it may not see water go to broadacre cropping of wheat, and it probably will spell the demise of small rice growers, for example. Okay, that's what markets do, but we're going to lose some things under this market-based policy, and the question has to be asked, are those things we're willing to lose? There's also a very strong environmental interest. The over-allocation of water in the basin means that rivers run dry, they don't flow high when they should flow high, and they tend to flow low when they should be flowing high, and flow high when they should be flowing low, because water is being stored and released for agricultural purposes. So there's environmental problems. The red gum forests that require periodic flooding to regenerate don't get the water as they used to. And so managing water in the basin for environmental purposes is about controlling storage and release, which doesn't necessarily time very well to the economic cycles of demand. So if we were to manage the river basin to ensure our environmental goals were met, that would have a potential impact on the economic goals of water in the basin. Again, there's a trade-off that is implied here. And there's a series of local values and goals about water. Small farming communities, small towns who've been on the land for 100 or so years, close social networks, strong senses of community, facing all sorts of pressures towards rural decline anyway, withdrawal of government services, withdrawal of banking services, young people moving away to cities, having to deal with the additional problem of higher priced water and small farms not being able to afford that water, particularly during periods of drought where water becomes more scarce, driving down the household firms that sustain those communities and putting pressure, increasing pressure on rural decline. So for these communities, water is very much a social good. It's a factor that is required to maintain those community values that are important to people. And allocating water for environmental purposes doesn't necessarily meet that goal, and allocating water to the highest value user also probably doesn't meet this goal. And finally, for farms at the level of an individual farm, most often this is a social and economic goal. It's about maintaining the farm enterprise at the level of a household, often which is a traditional thing. And often farming is not just a livelihood, it's a means to a way of life. They want secure access to water. They would like to know that next time the drought comes, they can still farm, pay their debts, maintain their farm enterprises, and continue to live on the farm. And again, the security of that entitlement is sometimes being limited and competes against the other goals of water. So this example of water in river basins, and river basins are a good example of the kinds of trade-offs that are involved in adaptation to climate change. As climate change is going to come into Australia, we're very likely to see far more variable runoff and supply of water at the same time that economic development and population growth in the basin will increase. There will be less water and less predictable water for increasing demand. How do we solve this problem? How are we going to trade off our macroeconomic goals versus our social goals versus our environmental goals? There's very difficult choices, and it's very likely that not everybody is going to get what they want in this adaptation example. And this is true in many adaptation examples, as we'll see in coming few lectures. So adaptation is necessary. We can't avoid this. We might as well plan for it, but it isn't going to be easy, and it's complicated by different interests and different values that working across different levels of social organisation, working across different groups and different sectors, each with their own sets of interests.